Hi, today I'm going to walk you through, step by step, according to the Marshal's Handbook, how to inspect arms and armor. Alright, let's start. So, the first part, inspecting bladed weapons. So, I've got this one here because it's easier to fit on the screen. The first part is inspect the overall weapon. Alright, check that the overall length is within the acceptable range. And in fact, this seems to present as a dagger, but it seems a little long. Whenever something is borderline to you, based on your experience, go ahead and measure it. Or first maybe ask the combatant. So if somebody presented this to me, I might say, is this a dagger? It seems a little long. And they might say, oh, no, actually it's 18.5 inches. This is a sword. Or they might say, I'm not sure, actually I got it from my uncle's garage. Then go ahead and measure it. Next is check that the weapon is in good repair. It doesn't seem like it's going to fall apart, for example, with a parry. So, holding it, all right, that seems pretty sturdy. Next is inspect the blade. Check for nicks that can cut an opponent, right? That's the point that we're trying to inspect for. So it is not a good idea to run your hand up and down this, because if there is such a nick that's going to cut flesh, well, that's your flesh that you might cut. So simply look at it and perhaps very lightly run your hand up and down the blade. Notice what I'm doing is I'm running it in one direction, but as soon as I feel something, I sort of go back and forth a little bit. And I'm very lightly touching it after I've already inspected it for anything major that sticks out. And if there's something that really feels like it's going to catch, then I would hand it back to the person and suggest that they go and file that down or sand that down and then come back. We'll talk about next time perhaps a kit that you might have that might be a nice to have for the people whose weapons you're inspecting and might need to fail temporarily. All right. Then look down the length of the blade and look for kinks. There you go. That's all. I'm simply looking straight down the blade and looking for kinks. For those of us who are quite old, we may remember that for foils and épées, an S-shaped curve is not allowed. That is not true for rapiers. That also includes daggers that we fight with rapiers. The types of kinks that we're looking for are sharp-looking kinks. This really does come down to your experience. You've been around this sport for quite a while. Look for anything that looks kind of fishy, kind of odd. Ask the person about it. They may have a kink in there that they say, yeah, actually, but if you look at it on the other side, it doesn't look that bad. It's just a grinding error, because they know their sword and they're aware of it. If they don't know their sword, that's a different matter. If you are fairly new, if you're uncertain for any reason, go ahead and take it up the chain. Get another marshal's opinion. If there is an S curve, it can be bent out, but I don't recommend that the marshal do it. At least definitely not without the person's permission. Okay, so ask them if it's okay that you try to bend that out. If it's a type of kink that comes back as soon as you start using the sword, then that sword needs to be retired. Similarly, check for flex. Now, the flex test is a 6-ounce weight that you put on the end of a sword. So you do not need to put the sword on the ground and push on it to get this massive bend to test their flex. All you need to do is just take it in your hand and do that. That's all it takes, because we only need, on a dagger, a 1/4 inch of bend, on a sword, a 1/2 inch of bend. So that's all you need. And if you feel that flex, that's good enough. You're not in danger of doing anything harsh to the person's sword. Check the tip. Check that the tip isn't likely to fall off. Go ahead and pull on that a little bit. Look at the tip. See if the sword is starting to pop through. Look to see that the tip is wide enough. I purposely chose this sword because this is just the bare minimum of the size of the tip that is allowed in our sport. All right, conferring back with the list. We're done with the bladed weapon part. One more thing. With an unorthodox type of tip, say a leather tip, there's really no way that you're going to know whether the thickness of that leather meets our standard. Once again, ask them. They should know what's on their tip. Maybe they're not the one who tipped it, but someone else did it for them. If they don't know, perhaps that sword can't be used the day, but most of the time the person does know. Hey, I see this is tipped with leather. Does that leather meet the ounce requirement that's set in our rules? Presuming they say yes, then off you go. It is incumbent upon the fencer to have read the rules and to really make sure that their arms and armor meet our standards. The marshal's job is to basically make sure that they still do on that day, that they didn't forget something, for example. Next on the weapon, check that the keons and pommels do not have any sharp or pointed ends. In fact, from this angle, that one could look like it's sharp. But they're actually pretty wide, and when you feel it, they're not sharp. So I'd say this one would pass. Same thing with all of these other points. None of these are sharp. Neither does this present any hazard to an opponent. Okay? Inspect defensive objects. Check for any major splinters, nicks, or features that can injure an opponent. Much like with this sort of non-standard head holding this blade, this really does come down to common sense. Do they have any spikes sticking out of their buckler that could injure someone if that buckler makes contact with them? Or do they have just rondelles on their buckler that once they make contact with someone is really just a pressure? Next is inspecting projectile weapons, and to be honest with you, we're going to do a whole video on that since projectile weapons is a category that is a little bit more clearly defined in this rule set. Next is inspecting a spear, which comes down to make sure that the spear is simply made up of a rubber head and a rattan haft. Check the flexibility of the head, check the width of the haft. Let me pull one out. So here's a spear. The flexibility of the head, does it bend under hand pressure? Sure, this one does. Does it substantially return to its shape within 3 seconds? Oh, yes, this one does, that's for sure. Is the head between 4 inches and 20 inches? Sure it is. Once again, if it's questionable, if it looks like, hey, I'm not entirely sure if that's 4 inches, sure, pull out your tape measure. But for most of them, you don't need to. Yeah, that looks right. I've seen this type before. I know that these are good in terms of length. But still do check that flexibility. Right? It is possible that the manufacturer will have a bad batch, and we might see some come on the field that are too hard or too soft. So go ahead and just give it a quick test. Oh yeah, that comes back. Same thing with the haft. Sure, this haft looks right. Based on my experience as a marshal, this haft looks right. But if I'm not sure, go ahead and measure it. Same thing with the length. Is it 9 feet or less? Well, I know how tall I am, and I know kind of what 9 feet feels like next to me. This one passes the test.